Starting now, welcome to day 2 of Communist University, and welcome to people who are watching online through different social forums. Today's session is going to be introduced by Ben Lewis, who I understand is going to be talking about 45 minutes or so, might be a little bit more. And Ben's going to speak on the line Liebknecht and Bebel, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. After that, I'll be taking questions and contributions as usual. Can I remind comrades to put their phone onto silent throughout Ben's discussion and the subsequent discussion thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming on a Sunday morning. Hope you're well. The light topic of the Franco-Prussian War and everything around it, and hopefully subsequently, I'll see how much I can fit in terms of time. I don't want to speak. I'm not a military historian. I don't want to speak in too great detail about the precise nature of this particular conflict. But a certain background, a certain introduction is necessary, I think. Then I kind of want to go on to look at how this conflict, or the run-up and to the conflict and its outbreak, the response that led to within German society more generally, and then look at that's when we come on to Bebel and Liebknecht, the response of the German socialist movement, split at that time into two main organizations. Then I want to talk, I think possibly, hopefully, the slightly more interesting aspect of the talk, I think, will be the question of how that particular experience, the response of German socialists to the Franco-Prussian War, so-called, was then subsequently utilized, instrumentalized, discussed, etc., to make particular points at particular junctures within the history of the German workers' movement. So what I call the afterlives of the Franco-Prussian War, because as you can probably imagine, this kind of iconic events, these iconic events of Bebel and Liebknecht opposing the Franco-Prussian War amidst the horror of the fellow deputies, to the point where they're surrounding them, haranguing them, etc., in the parliamentary chamber. It's obviously an incredibly powerful moment in German society generally, but also particularly within the German left. And I look then at how this experience fed into disputes and discussions within German social democracy up to World War I. We could go beyond that, but I think for today that will suffice. In terms of the Franco-Prussian War itself, it's very interesting and highly revealing, I think, that there are at least 3 different names for this conflict, depending on which language you have to be working in. Like, my French is not good enough to say the word 1870, but in French it's called La Guerre de 1870, the War of 1870. In English we call it the Franco-Prussian War for particular reasons. And in German, it's actually called der Deutsch-Französische Krieg, which is interesting because that literally means the German-French War. So the order is reversed, but also you have the word German for the first time. And obviously in 1870, there is no Germany per se. There's the North German Federation under the leadership of Bismarck, as I'll discuss in a second. So you can see how this war is its origins, its nature, its essence are disputed and find reflection immediately in the names, in the various ways of referring to it in various languages. In many ways, it's a very complicated run-up, and that's what I think makes this experience particularly informative and useful, and kind of a way to think about Marxism and theories of imperialism, etc. But essentially, you could say that it boils down to a classic kind of succession crisis. So there's a lovely poster of Isabella II and his son Alphonse, her brother-in-law, the Duke of Montpensier, and a Carlist observing in Paris an advert about a search for a king in Spain. Let's see what's going on. And this is essentially, while this is given as the reason for the outbreak of the war, what we can see is that this actually functions as more of a pretext for the outbreak of the war. This conflict completely remakes Europe in essence in the 19th century, and in a point that's made by several Marxist socialists subsequently, it kind of paves the way for the alliances that dominate later and form the basis of World War I. We have a situation at this time where France under Bonaparte, Louis Bonaparte III, is dominant, but is threatened by the rise of the North German states under Prussian leadership, which is growing in influence and size and strength through a series of military victories in the 1860s, Austria and Denmark. Bismarck famously says, of course, when it comes to the war with Denmark, that there's two people that understand the Schleswig-Holstein question in Germany and Denmark, and I think one of them's forgotten it already or something like that, right? So you know, I said I don't want to go into too much of the ins and outs of these details. You have loads of maps and things like that to show you, but essentially you have the rise of two strong powers within Europe, and there is that immediate tension of what's going to happen as a result of that. That's where we come to the question of the disputed origins of the Franco-Prussian War. So, formally speaking, it is France that declared war against the North German Federation, but the immediate reasons for it are far more shrouded in kind of controversy. I mentioned the question of the succession. What happens is that a Hohenzollern prince, so one of the German princes, is put forward as a candidate for this Spanish throne. And then obviously from Bonaparte's perspective, that's not a particularly strong position to be in, with the Hohenzollerns and the Germans both to the south and to the east. But what actually happens in a meeting, a famous meeting in Ems, is that the King of Prussia is sent to meet with the emissary of the French, Benedetti is his name. And they basically come to quite an amicable agreement. They say, well, look, Prince Leopold, the Hohenzollern prince, is quite happy to renounce his claim. We understand that this could lead to problems between our two countries, etc. And indeed, throughout the 1860s, there are a whole number of issues that are able to be resolved amicably. The most famous one is the so-called Luxembourg question about the ownership of railways through Luxembourg, which then plays out in the conflict itself, the use of railways for deploying troops and material, etc. But these are kind of amicably resolved. But it's quite clear, certainly in retrospect, that from the French side and from the Prussian side, let's call it, there is a desire for war. There is a desire to deal with the growing or the strong neighbor to the east or the west, depending on how you look at it. So there's this great thing again, Bismarck in his, I think it was reported in a Viennese newspaper, Bismarck had a dinner party I think in the early 1890s, where he describes exactly what happens here. And they get this telegram, the famous Ems dispatch, or the Ems telegram, the Ems cable. And they're sitting in Berlin with von Moltke and von Roon, two of his leading officers. And they get this telegram saying that, well, actually, what's happened is the King of Prussia has shown himself to be very conciliatory. There's no question, there's no dispute anymore about the succession. We're going to step back from that. And he reads this telegraph and he goes, shit, right? Because Bismarck is one of my favorite Bismarck quotes. There are many of them. He's an eminently quotable person. Is the true statesman must grab the coattails of God as he passes by the stage of world history, right? And clearly, from the German perspective, but also from the French, I'll focus more on the German side, obviously, because that's what I do. For him and for those around him, this succession crisis offered the kind of perfect opportunity to provide a rationale to go ahead and deal with France. So he turns to Moltke and in Berlin after receiving the telegram. And he says, Moltke, are our forces capable enough to beat the French at this moment? Do you think we're well enough? Are we able to mobilize? Can we govern them? Moltke says, yes, absolutely confident. So the Bismarck, again, the term is disputed whether he edited, falsified, redacted. So there's different ways in German and French, again, a bit like the what you call the Franco-Prussian War. sure what exactly he did to this cable, but the telegraph was amended and then immediately sent to the newspapers, the press, and every government except for the French. So there's basically, and the way he said this is that, essentially, the French ambassador Benedetti insulted the King of Prussia. The issues were not resolved, and now we have to wait and see what happens next. And that is in part what leads to the declaration of war on the part of France in December. This, in a time, I've got a picture here of a German nationalist student fraternity, and the response in German society. So it's, again, the North German League and the southern states. There's the Northern German League and the League of Prussia. There is what Liebknecht refers to later as an orgy of chauvinism that breaks out as a this declaration on the part of France. In the southern states that are for more of a neutral position, are concerned by the dominance and the rise of Prussia as the dominant state. There are even kind of mob riots and attacks by German Prussian nationalists, and this atmosphere is such as well that when it comes to the vote the vote to abstain on war credits by Bebel and Liebknecht, the house is attacked as well by an angry mob, and house windows are smashed in, etc., etc. And Bismarck is kind of aware of this situation and again able to steer. It's some kind of seen sometimes as the first use of fake news to mobilize people and get a sort of a thirst and an appetite for war, right? And I think that's also a thing to think about. That mobilization is also that mobilization, in opinion, in many ways, and this is what we'll look at later on in terms of German social democracy, is not actually dissimilar to that of August and September 1914, that framed in the language of defense and averting a threat from the outside, right? And indeed, that has a good basis, because it's hardly the case that Bonaparte is a friend of democracy or a friend of popular sovereignty, or etc. Engels was quite clear that the very essence of Bonaparte's regime, as he declared himself emperor, it absolutely was reliant on it. It necessitated an appeal to French chauvinism, and therefore inherently needed wars, territorial acquisitions, and so on to return to the borders of 1814. And the King of Prussia, who I mentioned earlier on at the meeting of Ems, the way he framed it was, we have no war aims here apart from peace and freedom from the violent acts of our foreign conquerors. So you can see how the whole conflict is set up. Moreover, and there are also echoes of 1914 here, on the German side, there's very much this idea that this will be the last war. So it's unfortunate that it's happened. Obviously, the French have foisted it upon us. But actually, if this war can be resolved, then there will be it will lead to a kind of amicable peace within Europe, which obviously isn't the case. And I'll come back to that in terms of the dispute between Jaurès and Luxembourg. What is also interesting about the outcome of the war is that France is tied to Germany by reparations, which again feeds into is a significant phenomenon when it comes to later history. So that's the broad landscape. I'll come back onto the German national question in a second. But in terms of the immediate response in July 1870 of the two organizations of German socialism, the Thessalian Adav and the so-called Eisenach Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, we can see a contrasting, but in some ways also overlapping response. And I can read here the lead article from the LaSalle paper, the Social Democrats. It's confusing that the LaSalle paper is called the Social Democrat, but that's the way it is. In July 1870, it says this: war has been declared. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte is using his standing army, we'll come back to that later on as well, because that's also important in terms of the war, the way the war plays out, to attack Germany without any proper reason for doing so. All Germans who stand against this violator of peace are fighting not only for the fatherland, but against the main enemy of the ideas of the future, freedom, equality, and fraternity. 3 days later, in that same newspaper, the Lassallian newspaper, Sozialdemokrat, there is a further one that says, any German who does not stand by his own people is a traitor. The newspaper of Bebel and Liebknecht, the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, is called the Volksstaat, People State. And it says, if Bonaparte wins, then democracy will be defeated in France and in Europe. Our interests require Bonaparte's destruction. And this particular quote I actually got from reading Bebel's memoirs written sometime later, when he then goes on to explain that actually he was kind of mistaken in this, and we'll come on to why in a second. But essentially you find that there is a sense among the German socialist movement, also among Marx and Engels in London, which I'll discuss in a second, that this is a war, this is a justified war of defense, and is significant to the future of both the German nation and also the German workers' movement, as kind of using a new united Germany as the basis for its organization and its work. Ferdinand Freiligrath, who is a very famous German poet, worked with Marx on the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, for example. He wrote at this point, "Hurrah, Germania, you beautiful, beautiful woman." Right? So you get this kind of sense of where these things are going. When it comes to the war credits vote, there is, despite, as I say, a certain overlap in the responses of both wings of the movement. There are 3 Lassallian deputies. One is Johann Baptist von Schweitzer, who was a very significant figure in that organization. They actually vote in favor of war credits in the first time around, on the basis that, you know, this is war of defense, and it is an important one. A statement, for example, of a statement by the leading committee of the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, that's also put across clearly, and it leads to a controversy between Bebel and Liebknecht as their deputies and the leading committee, the so-called Braunschweig Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party in Germany. So again, I'll read their statement of 24th of July, 1870. The Braunschweig Committee says that the SAPD supports a war of defense, a Verteidigungskrieg in German, and calls for courage and enthusiasm to help our brothers to victory in France against the French droves of mercenaries. Again, the use of the term mercenaries is significant here in that. The statement finishes with the call, long live Germany, long live the international struggle of proletariat. Right? And again, this seems contradictory or paradoxical, but will also it's also reflective of the complexities here in this, not only in the in the general situation, but in the concrete context of what's happening in July 1870. Liebknecht, as a parliamentary deputy of the SAPD, so the Braunschweig Committee, he is not happy with this statement, and makes several points in response to it. He condemns it and accuses his comrades of falling for patriotic nonsense, and threatens even to resign as a result of that July statement that I just read out. He is nonetheless clear that Bonaparte is, and I quote, the cornerstone of reaction in Europe, right? And he describes the atmosphere later on in a book which unfortunately hasn't been translated yet. That the Ems Dispatch, or How Wars Are Made, is the title of the pamphlet from 1892, I think. And he describes the atmosphere as one of swimming against the tide. And I think that's where that phrase comes from in German socialism, the groups called swimming against the tide, right? And he says that swimming against the current is never easy, and when it rushes by with the speed and force of the Niagara, then there's certainly no small matter to do so. But what could be done? What had to be, had to be. You had to grit your teeth and let what was coming come to you. There was no time for fear. We couldn't leave the front. We had to stay at our posts. come what may. So he's again speaking about several things here, that when he makes the decision alongside Bebel to abstain on war credits in the first round of voting for this war, he's not only met with, as I say, parliamentary colleagues, so-called surrounding him, haranguing him, almost kind of leading to threats of violence, etc., but also he feels slightly isolated from some of the leading members of his organization, the Braunschweig Committee. Right? And this is also then true of Marx and Engels and their take on this from abroad. The three main players here writing to the Braunschweig Committee extensive correspondence: Marx, Engels, and Kugelmann, which is, again you'll be familiar with him. And they are, in a sense, albeit not in the kind of florid language of hurrah Germania and brothers fighting against French mercenaries, they are nonetheless closer politically, not to the position of Liebknecht that I just described, but actually of the Braunschweig Committee, right? The war, Verteidigungskrieg, a war of defense. The reason for this, of course, is that Marx and Kugelmann in particular, I think Kugelmann sets the tone here actually in this discussion. Like this, Marx in his correspondence says, I absolutely agree with what Kugelmann wrote on this question, which is to stress, of course, the positive aspects of German unification, right? So, but they're looking for German unity, not on the basis of the Bismarckian blood and iron and the jackboot from above, as it were, but understanding that this is a process out of which a united Germany could emerge, which would be an incredibly important step forward. However, doing so on the basis, partly at least, of not really understanding the immediate trigger, if you like, for that particular conflict with the Ems dispatch and everything, because that doesn't really come out of the wash until years later. But that's by the by for now. I'll return to that question. You can read Marx's inaugural address to the First International, 7th of August 1870. So this is kind of just about a month or so, 3 weeks or so along. He describes it as a German war of defense, but, and this is an important caveat as well, he says that Bismarck's policies themselves led Germany into this position of the necessity of defense, right? So he doesn't know the immediate trigger of the Ems dispatch, to say that comes out in the wash in a Viennese newspaper 10 years later or 12 years later. But he's clear that the Bismarck ambitions and wars of acquisition and conquest, etc., have set up this position to the point where it becomes a kind of self-defense, becomes an inevitability, right? And I think that's an important caveat in this discussion. And I'll come back to instrumentalization and abuse of Marx and Engels and Bebel and Liebknecht later on. And he also makes the third point that if Germany gave up the defensive nature of its war, so if the nature of the war were to change, then both victory and defeat would be equally baleful for the interests of the German workers' movement and for Germany and for European development more generally. So that's the way Marx is kind of, that's probably what we call his immediate public response to these developments in August 1870. Engels, maybe slightly a slight nuance, difference in nuance in emphasis. Again, I haven't gone into this in great detail, so it's more kind of open than a strong idea I have. He essentially says, and this is picked up later on in 1914, there can be no question of indifference or abstention, which is an important word here, when it comes to the issue of a nation's existence, he says. And he argues that the German socialists should join the national movement to the extent that, and only as far as, it limits itself to German defense and comes to an honorable peace with the French Republican government expected to emerge from war. It's interesting, by the way, just as a side on this, that I talked about the German high command feeling that it was prepared. Actually, it came as not maybe to Marx and Engels and others, but most people thought France would actually be successful or be in a much better position than it did. And France got routed in this war pretty quickly, right? But that's worth bearing in mind here, because for the left, for the socialists, they do actually expect pretty much from the get-go. This is a month before the Battle of Metz and Sedan, where the turning point is really in the war, right? And it's captured, etc. They expect some kind of change in France to come about, the empire to a republic. Now, that's the kind of broad outline of these various positions. The Lassalleans, they're here, Marx and Engels maybe here, and then people like Liebknecht are there. And it's interesting. I'll come on to Bebel in a second for his reasoning. It does differ slightly to that of Marx and Engels, at least at this point. What happens, though, I mentioned the Battle of Metz and Sedan, is that certainly from September the 1st, 2nd, 1870, it's clear that the rhetoric of the King of Prussia that we have no interest apart from peace and self-defense, the rhetoric in the press of, the foreign conqueror with their mercenaries invading our territories, etc., that is shown to be a lie. And that really, what then happens with that is that if we leave aside Marx and Engels for now, the obvious shift in the nature of that conflict from, again, these terms are loaded from a war of defense to a war of expansion and acquisition and annexation. That brings the two main wings of the German socialist movement together. So when it comes to the second round of votes for war credits in the North German Reichstag, Bebel, Liebknecht, and von Schweitzer and the Lassalleans all vote together for the first, and they actually then come out to opposing them. So that's, I think, worth mentioning. And what happens, it's actually interesting in terms of the later development of the two main socialist parties in Germany and how they come together in 1875, is that immediately in September, they start to cooperate, not just at a parliamentary level, but also in terms of organizing demonstrations against the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine and calling for peace with the new French Republic. The response to this on the German side, on the North German side, is that the Braunschweig Committee, which I mentioned, the leadership of the SADP, is arrested and imprisoned on the 9th of September. Publication is banned along with any discussion of Germans' plans to annex various parts of French territory. Then we come to, again, as a reflection of this is in 1871, the second address of Marx to the International, where he describes the Bong of Strasbourg. Quite insightfully, he says that the annexations that are being forced upon France by the Germans are playing into Russian hands, as he puts it. And he calls a national war of liberation, the so-called national war of liberation, was a government swindle. And again, that becomes clear in the shifting nature of the war. When it comes to Bebel, I'll concentrate a little bit more on Bebel and his response, because I think it's interesting also Bebel as a kind of mediator or a kind of go-between, sometimes between the political leadership of the Braunschweig Committee and the Lassalleans and Marx and Engels. And he manages to avoid a public dispute with Marx and Engels. I think you're not the first time nor the last. And he, from the outset, he kind of views it as a dynastic war or a war between dynasties. And when it comes to justifying what he did in the North German Reichstag Parliament with Liebknecht, he basically makes the case, and again, Marx points this out when it comes to Bismarck, that Prussia had been preparing for this conflict at least since 1866, following its designs against Austria, Hungary, and Denmark. And it was therefore mistaken, as the Lassalleans did, to vote to approve war credits. But, and I quote here, as opponents in principle of all dynastic wars, as social republicans and members of the International Working Men's Association, Fifth International, we cannot declare ourselves in favor of this war directly or indirectly, so we will abstain from voting. And as I say, subsequently, Bebel writes in his memoirs that had he known what had actually gone down with Bismarck and the Ems dispatch, then there would be no question in his mind, and he subsequently is how he accounted of abstention. He actually, what he said, probably the thing to do from the outset was to vote no, which again raises questions about who shoots first, what's a particular trigger, how does that influence the behavior of politicians? Because, again, I'll come back to, in 1914, a certain Karl Kautsky, in the run-up to that, to the parliamentary vote on August 4th, 1914, says, well, we need to do like Bebel and Liebknecht and abstain. Right? So these questions, as you can imagine, are also picked up later on, and again have a burning relevance today as well. I'll briefly mention the high treason trial. So the war is, again, the turning point of the war is in September, the Battle of Sedan, in particular, the capture of Bonaparte. But people, I think, then forget that war rages on over the winter, with losses on both sides, particularly on the French side, but a harsh winter. And it's then Bebel and Liebknecht, they both get 2 years in isolation in prison. Bebel called it the University of Prison because he studied a lot and went away and wrote a lot. And their trial in Leipzig in 1872, they managed quite skillfully as speakers to turn it into a kind of tribune for the socialist ideas and the socialist organization for their organization. And it's really interesting, the trial, the way in which the prosecutors go about it, because they literally dig up anything, any socialist literature they can get their hands on, and say, that's what you think, that's what you said. And even the Communist Manifesto, they're kind of accused of writing the Communist Manifesto, bizarrely. And then, but which is a really interesting thing, because then you can say, well, okay, I didn't write it, that's what I think about it, and then let's bring up this nuance on this question on democracy. And they quote this. I say, you know, you want this violence, mob rule, etc. But that's really interesting. Let's take a look at this and see actually what we want is fundamental transformation of society. Lassalle said this, Marx said this. So there's a kind of really nuanced and interesting dialogue, and they're able to turn it around. And I think it, again, an incredibly powerful moment. Bebel also gets nines for insulting the Kaiser, but I can't remember exactly what he said. But that wasn't the last time either, on that one. So yeah, so that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of all of these things. I'm not doing justice to the complexity of them, or indeed what exactly happened, but we have sketched, you know, the situation, the complex geopolitics of Europe at the time, and the response of German society and German social democracy, and its different nuances and different takes, and how that shifted during the course of the conflict. What I want to do now is look at some of the afterlives of this experience, of this war, of discussions of this war in German social democracy. The first of which, or a significant one of which, is the discussion around Sedan Day. Sedan Day is essentially a Bismarckian German nationalist, you know, following the unification of Germany in 1871. It's one of these days in which, you know, the foundation myth, if you like, of 1871, where people, particularly from the middle classes and the student fraternities, of which Marx was a member, by the way, but I can maybe explain that in the discussion, where they get together and have a good jolly. So here you've got, you know, the great Sedan celebrations. You've got competitive bowling, so you know, women get in free, as do children, and this great Japanese fireworks apparently as well. So this was a day, again, a kind of state-sponsored day to celebrate the foundation of Germany or the defeat of Bonaparte, or however it was going to be spun. Moltke, I mentioned earlier on, was not happy about the choice of September the 2nd initially, because he's like, well, nothing happened on that day. It should have been late August, early September, where we, you know, that was the bravery of the soldiers, etc. So there's this big discussion about Sedan Day. But the general point to be made, as you can imagine, the workers' movement consistently opposed this celebration. It stayed away from it. It wanted nothing to do with it, because, well, for obvious reasons. And even in through to the Weimar Republic, I think it kind of dies a death. I haven't looked at it, what happens to it under National Socialism, only in the sense I found very little. But certainly in the Weimar Republic, there were attempts to celebrate Sedan Day on the part of the German right. And it must be said that they were countered demonstrations by the SPD and the KPD, and indeed the USPD, the one between them, together. There's like joint actions against Sedan Day. Why is this significant? Why is this this sidestep important? We come to a guy called Ignaz Auer, Nazi Auer as he was called, obviously not the National Socialist variety, this was his nickname. And he, in a really important and in a sense quite worrying speech in 1895, what's known as a sorry speech, makes quite an interesting revisionist case. He says, look, we are getting all sorts of shit from all sections of society for not taking part in Sedan Day. Why don't we take part in Sedan Day? We don't like Bonaparte. He was horrible. Now we've got a German nation and a German National Social Democratic Party. A good thing. We should celebrate that. And he says, if the fall of Bonaparte was something positive, why do we not celebrate it? One of certainly none of you, if you don't read German, you'll probably never heard of this speech, or that there is one reference to it in English, and that's actually Rosa Luxemburg's Unionist pamphlet in 1950, which I'll come back to. Rosa Luxemburg has a very strange relationship with Ignaz Auer, politically, I should say, intellectually, because this guy is a spokesman of the hard right of the SPD, but she always made a certain admiration for him, and again, I translated the speech he gave at his funeral on behalf of the Polish Social Democrats in 1905, where she kind of says, yeah, he was a right winger, but actually he was a really good politician, etc., etc. And so she does actually not criticize this this pamphlet in this particular work, but she does make the point. And Auer here, in terms of his setting across what was so good about social democracy, he says, I'm quoting Luxemburg here, for that is, says Auer in his Sedan Fire, social democratic politics, seeing things clearly as they are and differing therein from the day-by-day politics of the others, bowing blindly down before every momentary success. And what she's talking about here is Marx's understanding that Germany's or Prussia's behavior in the Franco-Prussian War with the annexations will actually lead to its estrangement, rapprochement, between France and Russia in the dual alliance. And she says that's precisely what social democrats, Marx was laughed at the time, etc., but that's precisely what social democrats politics is seeing beyond the momentary. So that when it comes to Liebknecht was the editor of Vorwärts Daily, a newspaper, and you can just see here, it's hard to see with the writing, but there's the very small text in between are the editorial interjections of a report of our speech in the daily press. And Auer says here, for example, that when it comes to Alsace, now that mistake has been made, so he does see it as a mistake, the annexation, but what can we do about it now? Type thing. We might as well just get on with political reality as it is, right? And then, interestingly enough, from what I've just said, he says that those who claim that social democracy has always been against the nation, it's a downfire, and against the monarchy are falsifying our own history. So you can see how this Franco-Prussian War experience plays out there as well. And I say with the small text, you can actually see, I think, Liebknecht's interjections and corrections, as he puts them. He's really pissed off about this, particularly when it comes to the question of Alsace. I'm looking at time, yeah. So other afterlives, I think, that are significant on the question of the militia. So I mentioned how one of the, again, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but one of the factors behind the success of the Prussian victory was precisely conscription, as opposed to the French system, as far as I understand it, was formally conscription, but you can kind of buy yourself out of it, right? And so when it came to the Prussian army, it was able to mobilize far more quickly and far more effectively. And there's a really interesting discussion in 1908 between Jean Jaurès and Luxemburg, and precisely over the question of peace and peaceful development. So for Jaurès, he goes along with the idea, and this is in 1908, that the Franco-Prussian War, as horrible as it was, it has nonetheless paved the way for a kind of European peace, right? So there hasn't been war in Europe since, etc. And Luxembourg takes him on for this and polemicizes with him, saying, "Well, look, the war is coming home, basically, right? So all that's happened is the power disputes between the leading nations have been taking place on the periphery, as we would say today in modern, but it's coming back to us." And she says that the only Jaurès is wrong to sow illusions in this idea that peace will emerge in the next few years. The only real guarantee of peace, she says, is the popular militia, which is why it's reflected in and that's why it's in the SPD's program. Jaurès far more skeptical towards that. She says it's not necessary for the peoples to bleed to death to protect the fatherland. It's not necessary to reduce the blossom of the people to unthinking, mindless dogs under the control of the sergeants. The fatherland is much better protected by putting weapons into the hands of the people than by being at home in front of the stove. Only when Germans carry weapons in their own hands does the saying, "Dear fatherland, rest quietly," be fully achieved. There's an interesting polemic there between the two of them. Also on the Alsace questions, Alsace-Lorraine. In 1911, what happened is that, and Bebel is really, really annoyed by this as he enters his later life. He's stage not one really to enter into big public fights necessarily with the party. But what happens is that the SPD Reichstag faction vote for a constitutional reform in Alsace-Lorraine, which on the one hand then legitimizes that entity, right, as a German protectorate territory, but also does things like, kind of reinforce the power of the monarchy, the German state, etc., for nothing. And the reason given was, okay, now there's going to be some kind of universal suffrage in Alsace, and that will help the struggle for suffrage. But again, Luxembourg is very strong on this question and says, basically this is a travesty that the deputies voted for this and at least didn't abstain. I'll skip forward on the military budget, but again, it's pointing out that in 2013, again, the Reichstag faction votes for a renewed military budget on the basis that it's going to be funded by taxation, therefore half realizing the SPD's fiscal plans, etc. So again, these questions of war credits, military budgets, and constitutional questions relating to Alsace come back. In 1907, Bebel is talking about, again, in contrast to Jaurès, he's talking about the coming war in Europe. And he says, how many of those alive today experienced the war of 1870 as men who were capable of forming their own judgment? How weary was Bismarck of a second clash with France? Some speak so lightly of such a war, but anyone who lived through the hardship, the misery, the unemployment of that terrible winter of 1870-71 will never ask for a second round. And what is to come will be infinitely worse, more violent, and in no way comparable to what happened in 1870. And that's, sets the scene, I suppose, but in a kind of almost tragic way for what happens in the coming years within German social democracy. Just 7 years later, the party voting for war credits. What I want to highlight here, though, is that while Bebel has been used and abused as a kind of anti-war, anti-militarist hero, and in some ways quite rightly so, as I've already alluded to, he's also been portrayed by others as somebody who would have probably abstained for war credits in World War I, a la Kautsky, and so on and so forth. And what's really interesting is that the kind of cult of Bebel that emerges after his death in 1913 takes many different forms. So there's a cult on the one hand, but there's also then, as I say, people drawing on certain aspects of his ideas and his writings and his speeches to flog their own particular trade or their own particular political response to World War I. So, for example, just to give a flavour of some of the different things that Bebel said, they're related to war of defence, etc. He says, a very famous speech of the Essen Congress of 1907. He says, if we're threatened by Russia, he said, I will be first person to shoulder my rifle and go off to the front. It's ailing off the band at this point. I don't think it caused them any problems, but I'll be the first person to shoulder my rifle and take up the fight, right? And so there's the Russian barbarism, etc. What's also interesting, I don't know if comrades have seen this, it's a book in German, but the actual material on which it's based is in English. And here I speak, again, rather pointedly of Bebel's Anglophilia. It's really interesting. There's a collection of documents, of letters, extensive correspondence that he wrote to, so alongside the whole political activity of raising the international, opposing war, etc., a whole collection of letters written to the British Council in Zurich, with correspondence there, trying to get across to the British in kind of secretly diplomatic kind of way exactly what is going on in Germany with its war aims, etc., and trying to find a kind of balance, a rapprochement behind the scenes to uphold peace. He was terrified, with good reason, I suppose, of a clash between England and Germany, and that's again, that's something that Mike has written about as well. This idea of a certain Anglophilia on the part of certain German thinkers in social democracy. Also, Bebel in his speeches would including in the German Parliament, raised the question of peace, brotherhood of nations, etc., and that's later picked up as well. So the text I've been looking at, I'll finish it in a second, Bob. That's okay. The text I've been looking at are from the Liebknecht, which is Clara Zetkin's magazine, three articles in particular. The Last War, which is about the Russian War. August Bebel, a year after his death, so in August 1914, upon hearing the news of the outbreak of war, what Bebel had to say before he died, and How Wars Start, which is again also about the Franco-Prussian War. What happens is, within German social democracy, as you can imagine, during the outbreak of World War I, there's a hell of a lot of discussion and reference points to the Franco-Prussian War and the parallels that can be drawn between that, the outbreak of war in July 1870, and the outbreak of war in August 1914. And that sets the tone for various trends within the German party, pro-war, anti-war with a certain agenda, centrist, etc., to draw upon the writings of Bebel. Unfortunately, in the last week or so, the Die Neue Zeit, which is Kautsky's journal, that's been down. I can't get a hold of the text, but I will come back to that when I write this up. But you can just see some of the text there that were published in Kautsky's journal in 1915-16. And two significant ones, I think, are both by David Ryazanov, looking at Marx and Engels' correspondence and writings precisely about the Franco-Prussian War. To what end, I'll have to leave you tantalizing with the conclusion there, because I need to wait and read those. But the fact that they're published in Die Neue Zeit in 1915 and 1916 may or may not give you a flavor of what Ryazanov's about there. So yeah, I essentially identify four strands that draw upon the experience of Bebel and Liebknecht, Bebel in particular. Zetkin, Clara Zetkin's writing, and again, I've translated these articles, I think a few of them are sent around as well, writing about August Bebel. She, at that point, is emphasizing Bebel's stress on peace, brotherhood of all nations, and moving away from, and again, this leads to, I gave a talk at this on this at Communist University a few years ago, her estrangement with Lenin and Bolshevik women in the anti-war conference in Bern in 1915, where she is very highly reluctant to subscribe to the idea that there must be civil war against the war, right? So that's a kind of fallout she had with Lenin, at least in 1915. So again, the emphasis is very much on peace at that point within her writings, and draws on Bebel to do that, including the piece on the precise origins of the Franco-Prussian War. Also, Luxembourg. Again, I mentioned the Unionist pamphlet, the Unionist brochure, the Unionist pamphlet. She makes the case essentially that it's no longer possible in a kind of epochal sense, right? So we've entered a new stage, a new epoch in a sense, where it's no longer possible to distinguish between wars of aggression and wars of defense, the Verteidigungskrieg that I talked about earlier on. But obviously with her, there's also the danger of the baby in the back, because she also said that national questions now are kind of no longer on the agenda, and so on and so forth. So, you know, she says, for example, that Serbia might indeed be a victim of Austrian aggression, but behind Serbian nationalism lies Russian nationalism. The centrist response, so Kautsky, Haza, others in and around my site, maybe Ryazanov, we can add to that too, I need to see. Kautsky, as I said, is of the view that the SPD deputies should not vote for war credits, but on the other hand, they shouldn't be seen to oppose war credits, given that there's a supposed existential threat to the German nation at this time. And again, what happens here is the invocation of Bebel's rifle, the Verteidigungskrieg, as opposed to a war of aggression, a war of annexation. And then this whole debate, which some of you will be familiar with as the war unfolds, is like, well, are we now in a war of aggression or war of self-defense, which I think is largely unhelpful. And in that sense, I'm sympathetic to Luxembourg's position, at least the first part of it. And again, they talk about, for example, one of the interesting things with Bebel, again, I could talk about this for a long time, but in the amendment to the resolution on war passed at the Stuttgart Congress of 1907 of the International, where it says that it was passed by Lenin, Luxembourg, and Martov, right? And they say that should war break out, it is the duty of socialists to turn that war into a social revolution, essentially. Bebel opposed that motion precisely on the grounds of legality. He feared that the party's legality would be jeopardized if it were passed. And again, that is precisely some of the things that are being said on the left, i.e. Setkin at this point, but also among the centre of the SPD. So again, it's this invocation of Bebel and certain aspects of his work to make certain points. The final one, which is, again, I need to develop that slightly more, is then the kind of the true, the renegade left to the right, the Die Glocke and Parvus type people, who can then also refer to a certain softness on the part of Bebel, Kautsky and others on English or British imperialism and naval dominance, etc., in its rhetoric. Okay, I'll wrap up. Going on for a while, but just the last slide is just some stamps from the GDR. I haven't even got into like Stalinism on Bebel, Liebknecht, etc., which is a whole other chapter. I wanted to keep within the framework of pre-1940 democracy. And I think that, as I say, it's absolutely right to invoke the spirit of Bebel and Liebknecht and their bravery, their anti-militarist bravery in swimming against the current in all the ways that they did it, right, including having their houses smashed in, being arrested, but also fighting politically against some of their own comrades. But I think, you know, as always with things, we have to realize that you know, we're not the first people to look back on and reflect on or try to draw something from that particular experience. And I think we have to be as concrete as possible, both in the historical context and the concrete events in which and landscape in which they were operative, but also in then thinking about concrete about how we think about these things today in response of what our response should be to you know, looming terrible war, to quote Bebel again, and how we think about this experience critically, and how we can then therefore draw as much as we can from it. Thank you very much.